Up to now, we've been talking mainly just about carbon and hydrogen and how we can change a carbon skeleton, um, maybe rearrange double bonds and things like that. But if we were just made up of carbon and hydrogen, it would be very hard to have any interaction with water. Um, so, in addition to having sort of those Legos, those carbon and hydrogen um, atoms, we have a couple of what we call functional groups, which are commonly repeated sets of atoms that are not just carbon and hydrogen that we can attach to the skeleton to change the chemistry. So functional groups are components of organic molecules commonly involved in chemical reactions. Arrangement of functional groups give organic molecules their unique properties. So this is going to be very important when we get into the last part of this, which is talking specifically about large biological molecules. So here are two molecules, estradiol and testosterone. Maybe you've heard of them. And here, this is again that organic chemist shorthand where they've just drawn in all these squiggles to represent carbons and hydrogens, and you only see something different if it's an oxygen or something different like that. So hopefully you recognize that testosterone and estradiol are very similar in their shape. There's just a couple of little differences outlined in here in that light blue that make them different. But estradiol is a hormone that is produced abundantly in the bodies of women, and testosterone is a hormone that is present in great abundance in the bodies of men. And if women start taking testosterone exogenously, adding testosterone into their diet, they will develop more male characteristics. Same thing is true for men who consume estradiol. They would develop more female characteristics. And the only difference is just a couple of these functional groups being placed on this fairly large hydrocarbon skeleton. So, yes, functional groups make a lot of difference in where they go. They have to be put in the right place or they're not going to do the right job. So the first functional group I want to tell you about is called a hydroxyl group. And it looks just like a hydroxide ion, but when it is attached to a carbon, it doesn't act like a hydroxide ion. Molecules that have hydroxyl groups on them attached to carbon are called alcohols, and the names of them typically end in OL. So alcohol, like the alcohol that is in alcoholic beverages, is ethanol. Not the simplest alcohol, but close to it. Here is ethanol. You can see here's that OH functional group, that hydroxyl functional group on the carbon skeleton. Estradiol, which I just mentioned, is another example of an alcohol, although it kind of acts more like a hydrocarbon because most of it is hydrocarbon. But there's that OH group that makes it technically an alcohol. Same thing with cholesterol, which you've probably heard of as something that you want to keep tabs on. Make sure your cholesterol levels in your blood are not too high or too dangerously low. And over here, this is isopropanol, or rubbing alcohol, which is another type of alcohol. Again, not hugely different from ethanol, but you wouldn't want to drink this. I mean, maybe you don't want to drink this either, but definitely don't want to drink isopropanol because it could be it's toxic. It'll harm you. So hydroxyl groups make compounds, or at least around the area near those functional groups, polar, because again, you've got oxygen, which is pulling electrons towards it and away from other atoms. So they can also form hydrogen bonds. Carbonyl group is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen atom. And if we were more invested in this, I would tell you more about ketones and aldehydes. Ketones are when the carbonyl group is in the middle of a carbon skeleton, like you can see here in acetone, or fingernail polish remover. There are aldehydes if they're at the end, so you can see this carbon is at the end of the skeleton with just a hydrogen here. But both of these carbonyl groups, these different types of carbonyl groups, are again polar because you've got oxygen that is pulling electrons away from that carbon that it's attached to. And they're also very important in sugars that we're going to talk about in the next portion of this chapter. Examples of ketones include nail polish remover, testosterone, tetracycline, which is an antibiotic, 4 rings, that's why it's tetracycline. Tetra means 4. Phenylpyruvic acid. Aldehydes include things like formaldehyde that has been used as a preservative, and a lot of compounds that are flavors, like vanillin is an aldehyde that gives vanilla its taste, and cinnamaldehyde is an aldehyde that gives cinnamon its taste. And then retinal is an aldehyde that is an important part of our visual system. A carboxyl group looks kind of like the last 2 functional groups put together, but it doesn't function that way. So a carboxyl group is also known as, these compounds are known as organic acids. So remember, acids are compounds that add protons to a solution. And these ones are no different. So here's acetic acid, which is the main ingredient in vinegar. And this proton here that is on this hydrogen here can go into solution. It can donate that proton, and that's why we consider them to be an acid. And then when it does that, it forms this ion here, this carboxylate ion. So now it's got a negative charge here. It's added the proton to the surrounding solution, and it gives it a charge. And we find organic acids in a number of different places. Maybe you've heard that you want to have omega-3 fatty acids in your diet, or you want to have MUFAs, monounsaturated fatty acids, in your diet that are supposed to be the healthier fats, like you might find in avocados or olive oil. And what they're talking about with omega-3 fatty acids is where there are double bonds in these fatty acids. So fatty acids have long hydrocarbon tails, and then they have this carboxyl functional group, this acid group in there as well. Here's butyric acid and caproic acid, relatively simple, short chain organic acids. Butyric acid is the smell of rancid butter. Caproic acid is the smell of goats. And if you've ever smelled a ginkgo tree, the seeds of a ginkgo tree kind of smell like, I guess the most polite way to say it is, I've heard them described as smelling like dog feces. But the reason they have that terrible smell is because they have a lot of these two organic acids in the seed coats of the seeds. The amino group is one that instead of having oxygen, it's got nitrogen in that functional group. And amines, while carboxyl groups functioned as acids, amine groups function in cells as a base. They can pick up protons from the surrounding solution. So remember, a base is something that either contributes hydroxide ions or it can absorb, it can pick up protons. So in this case, the latter is true. It acts as a base by picking up protons from the surrounding aqueous solution in cells. And when it is ionized, that nitrogen gains a positive charge. And this molecule here is glycine, which is an amino acid. It's got an amino group here in the purplish blue, and then it's got the carboxyl group, the acid, on this other end here. Okay, I believe this is the last one I want to tell you about. This is a phosphate group. Phosphates have a phosphorus atom with 4 oxygens around it. And phosphates are very important. As you might have guessed from looking at this functional group, a phosphate with a bunch of oxygens around it, it's a very reactive molecule. You've got these 4 oxygens that are pulling electron density away from that phosphate. You've got oxygens that are looking to form bonds because they're ionized. And in the presence of water, these phosphate groups can release a lot of energy. And this is happening billions, trillions of times a second in your body, that these phosphate groups are being added onto different molecules to give them a burst of energy. And they're also very abundant in our DNA. So how does that phosphate group add energy? Well, one way is through this molecule here, which is called ATP. That stands for adenosine triphosphate. I'll tell you about adenosine later on. For now, suffice to know that this is adenosine over here. Triphosphate is because there's 1, 2, 3 triphosphate groups. So ATP, in the presence of water, that third phosphate group will come off and maybe attach to another molecule. And you're ended up with ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, because it's just 2 phosphates, and a release of, poof, energy. So stuff gets done. All right, so we're going to talk a lot more about phosphate groups when we get to photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and when we talk about DNA. But I think hopefully you understand these learning objectives now. Why is carbon so important in molecules that make up living organisms? Mostly to do with those 4 valence electrons and the 4 bonds that it can form that make it very useful as a building material. And hopefully you can draw out those 5 different types of functional groups that I showed you. All right, so in the next lecture bit, next elephant bite, I will explain large biological molecules.